My fiance's phone rang during our wedding vows with the most romantic, spicy ringtone I'd ever heard. I was standing at the altar, crying happy tears, looking into the eyes of the man who made me feel seen like nobody ever had. He started his vows, talking about how I was the sun of his solar system. Right as he said those words, his phone started ringing. "Pony" by Genuine blared through the church. Every single person turned to stare. Norman's face went white. He fumbled with his pocket while the grinding beat echoed off the walls. Finally, he silenced it. "Who was that?" I asked. "Wrong number. Probably spam." "Norman, that's a custom ringtone. You assigned that song to someone specific. Show me the phone." He pulled it closer to his chest. "It's nobody. Can we just continue?" "No. We can't." I grabbed my dress and walked off the altar. Norman followed me into the church lobby. Both families rushed after us. "Was it another woman?" I asked. "No, I swear." "Then who was it?" Norman's mom pushed through the crowd. "It's his cousin Rebecca. She's overseas." I stared at her. "He has that song saved for his cousin?" She stuttered about an inside joke. "That's disgusting, and you know you're lying." I tried to grab the phone. He jerked away and it slipped, flying into the decorative fountain. The screen went black. Norman actually looked relieved. My maid of honor, Claire, stopped everyone. "If that call was just your cousin, why are you happy the phone is dead?" "I want the truth," I said, "or this wedding is over." Norman was shaking. "I can't. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay," he broke. "The woman's name is Vanessa. She's the mother of my child." The words didn't register. "What?" "I have a son. He's 4 years old. I never told you." My family exploded. I couldn't breathe. "But why does she have that ringtone?" "I said it years ago. She never calls, so I forgot to change it." "That doesn't explain why you were panicked." Norman looked sick. 3 months ago, Vanessa came back to town. We slept together. Once. My dad lunged forward, but my brothers held him back. "Why was she calling you today?" His mother answered. "She's pregnant." My knees buckled. Claire caught me. I pulled out my own phone. "Give me her number. Right now." Norman gave it to me. I called on speaker. The lobby went silent. "Hello?" A woman's voice answered. "This is Norman's fiancé. I'm at the altar right now. Is it true?" Long pause. "He didn't tell you?" "Tell me what?" Vanessa laughed, tired. "I'm not pregnant." "I called to warn you. Norman's been telling people I am, so he has an excuse to stay connected to me. He's been showing up at my apartment for months saying he wants to be a family again. I told him I'd call you if he didn't stop." "So there's no second pregnancy?" "No. But everything else is true. The son, the affair, all of it." I hung up. Norman started talking fast. "Baby, I can explain. You lied about a pregnancy to cover up stalking your ex?" "It wasn't stalking. You have a 4-year-old son you hid from me for 2 years. You cheated on me 3 months before our wedding. And when you got caught, you invented a fake pregnancy." He reached for my hand. I stepped back. "The wedding is off." His mother started wailing. His father dragged him toward the exit. My family surrounded me like a wall. Claire helped me out of the church. I was still wearing my dress when we got to her car. She didn't ask where I wanted to go. She just drove. We ended up at a diner. I sat in a booth in my wedding gown eating pancakes at 4 p.m., mascara running down my face. The waitress just kept refilling my coffee. Claire sat across from me. "What do you need?" "I need to know how I missed all of this." "You didn't miss anything. He hid it. That's not the same thing." I thought about the past 2 years. Every time Norman got quiet when his phone buzzed. Every business trip that seemed too long. Every time his mother looked at me with something that wasn't quite warmth. They all knew. I finished my pancakes and walked out into the parking lot still wearing my dress. "What now?" Claire asked. I looked down at the white fabric, the beading I'd spent months choosing, the train dragging through gravel. "Now I take this off," I said, and I never look back. Claire's apartment was smaller than the place I'd shared with Norman, but it felt safer somehow. I sat on her gray couch in my wedding dress and stared at the coffee table without really seeing it. My phone kept lighting up on the cushion next to me. Norman's name flashed across the screen again and again. Then my mom's name. Then my dad's. Then numbers I didn't recognize. I picked up the phone and turned it face down, but I could still feel it buzzing against my palm through the fabric of my dress. Claire brought me a glass of water and set it on the table in front of me. I didn't drink it. She sat in the chair across from me and didn't say anything. The silence felt heavy, but not uncomfortable. I looked down at the white beading on my dress and thought about how I'd tried on 17 dresses before finding this one. Norman had come to one of the fittings even though everyone said the groom wasn't supposed to see the dress. He'd told me I looked beautiful, and I'd felt so lucky that he couldn't wait. Now I wondered if he'd been checking his phone the whole time, texting Vanessa while I spun around in white fabric. My phone buzzed again. I turned it over and saw Norman's face on the screen, the photo from our trip to the mountains last fall. I'd taken that picture right after he'd told me he loved me for the first time. I pressed the power button and held it until the screen went black. The dress felt too tight suddenly. I stood up and reached behind me for the zipper, but my hands were shaking too much to grab it. Claire got up and walked over without me having to ask. She unzipped it slowly and the fabric loosened around my ribs. I could breathe again. I stepped out of the dress and stood there in my white underwear and strapless bra, looking at the pile of expensive fabric on Claire's floor. She picked it up carefully and started folding it. I watched her smooth out the wrinkles and arrange the train. She was treating it like it mattered even though we both knew I'd never wear it again. I sat back down on the couch in my underwear and pulled the throw blanket over my legs. Claire finished folding the dress and set it on the chair. She sat next to me and we didn't talk. The clock on her wall ticked past 7, then 8, then 9. I kept thinking about the past 2 years. Every time Norman's phone rang and he'd step into another room to answer it. Every weekend he said he had to work late. Every time his mom looked at me during family dinners with this expression I couldn't quite read. They all knew. His whole family knew he had a son, and they watched me plan a wedding and never said a word. I thought about Vanessa's voice on the phone, tired and matter-of-fact. She hadn't sounded angry or jealous. She'd sounded like someone who'd been dealing with Norman's lies for a long time and was just exhausted. I wondered what she'd told their son about his dad. I wondered if the kid knew Norman was supposed to get married today. The thought made my stomach hurt. Claire got up around midnight and came back with sweatpants and a t-shirt. I put them on and the dress stayed folded on the chair like a ghost. We sat on the couch and Claire asked me if I wanted to talk about it. I started going through everything in my head out loud. The business trip to Chicago that lasted 5 days when it should have been 3. The time I'd surprised Norman at his office and he'd seemed annoyed instead of happy. The way he always kept his phone face down on tables. The random Tuesday nights he said he had to help his brother move furniture or fix his dad's car. I'd believed all of it because why wouldn't I? People don't lie about helping their family. Except Norman did lie about his family. He lied about having a son. He lied about sleeping with Vanessa. He lied about her being pregnant. He'd probably lied about 100 other things I hadn't even figured out yet. Claire listened and didn't try to make me feel better with fake comfort. She just let me talk. Around 3 in the morning, I finally stopped talking, and we sat there in silence. My eyes felt dry and scratchy. I was too tired to cry anymore. Claire brought me a pillow and another blanket, and I lay down on her couch. She went to her bedroom and I heard her door close softly. I stared at the ceiling and watched the shadows from the streetlight outside move across the white paint. I thought about how this morning I'd woken up excited to marry Norman. Now I was sleeping on my best friend's couch in borrowed clothes and my whole life was different. I woke up to sun coming through Claire's living room window. My neck hurt from the couch pillow and my mouth tasted awful. I reached for my phone before remembering I'd turned it off. I held the power button and waited for it to come back on. 17 missed calls, 12 from Norman, 3 from his mom, 2 from my mom. I had 14 text messages. I opened the one from Norman's mom first. It said we needed to talk about misunderstandings, and that Norman was devastated, and that I should give him a chance to explain properly. I deleted it. Norman's texts were long paragraphs about how sorry he was, and how he never meant to hurt me, and how we could work through this if I just gave him a chance. I didn't read all of them. I heard Claire moving around in her bedroom, and then she came out wearing her robe. She looked at my face and asked if I'd checked my phone. I nodded. She went to the kitchen and started making coffee without saying anything else. The smell filled the apartment and reminded me of Sunday mornings with Norman. We used to make breakfast together and read the news on our phones, and it had felt so normal and comfortable. Now I couldn't tell which parts of that had been real and which parts had been Norman playing a role. Claire brought me coffee in the blue mug she always used for guests. I wrapped my hands around it and felt the warmth. She sat in the chair with her own mug and told me I didn't owe anyone explanations right now. I knew she was right, but I also knew I couldn't hide at her apartment forever. Eventually I'd have to deal with the wedding vendors and the apartment I shared with Norman, and all the practical pieces of a life I'd been building with someone who didn't exist. My phone rang and my dad's name showed up on the screen. I answered it and he asked where I was. I told him I was at Claire's. He said he and my mom were coming over. I said okay, and hung up. 20 minutes later, they were knocking on Claire's door. My mom hugged me so hard I couldn't breathe, and my dad stood behind her looking like he wanted to punch something. Claire let them in and made more coffee. We all sat in her small living room, and my parents told me that Norman's family had tried calling them last night. His dad had left a voicemail saying there had been a terrible misunderstanding, and that Norman loved me and wanted to make things right. My mom said she'd called back and told them there was no misunderstanding. Norman had lied and cheated and hidden a child. Those were facts, not misunderstandings. My dad said Norman's dad had tried to argue that Norman had been planning to tell me about his son after the wedding. My dad had hung up on him. I felt grateful that my parents were angry on my behalf because I was too tired to be angry anymore. I just felt empty. My mom asked what I needed, and I didn't know how to answer. I needed the past 2 years to be different. I needed Norman to not be a liar. I needed to not feel this stupid for missing all the signs. But I couldn't say any of that, so I just shrugged. My brothers showed up an hour later with garbage bags full of my stuff. They'd gone to the church and collected everything from the bridal room, and then they'd gone to the apartment while Norman was out. My oldest brother set the bags down in Claire's entryway and told me they'd grabbed clothes and my laptop and some other things. He said Norman had come home while they were there, but they'd finished packing and left without talking to him. My middle brother said it had taken everything in him not to say something. I thanked them, and they both hugged me. My youngest brother asked if I needed them to do anything else. I told them no. They left after making me promise to call if I needed anything. I looked at the garbage bags full of my life and felt overwhelmed. Claire helped me drag them into her bedroom, and we started going through them. My brothers had grabbed things randomly. 3 pairs of shoes, but not the ones I wore most. 5 t-shirts, but none of my jeans. My laptop, but not the charger. I pulled out a framed photo of me and Norman from last Christmas and stared at it. We looked so happy. I set it face down on Claire's dresser and kept unpacking. By afternoon, I knew I had to start dealing with the practical mess. I found a notebook in one of the bags and sat at Claire's kitchen table. I started writing down everything that needed to be canceled or dealt with. The venue, the caterer, the photographer, the florist, the honeymoon flights and hotel, the apartment lease that was in both our names, the joint bank account we'd opened for wedding expenses. The list kept getting longer, and I felt my chest getting tight. Each item represented something I'd planned and looked forward to. The venue where we were supposed to have our reception. The flowers I'd spent hours choosing. The honeymoon in Italy that Norman had suggested because he knew I'd always wanted to go. Every single thing on the list was a piece of the future I'd thought I had. I got to the bottom of the page and added one more item. Wedding dress alterations I'd already paid for. I'd never need the final fitting now. I put the pen down and put my head in my hands. Claire came over and looked at the list. She didn't say anything for a minute. Then she suggested I call the wedding planner first. Valeria could help coordinate with all the vendors. I didn't have to make every call myself. I looked up at Claire and felt a rush of gratitude. I'd been so focused on the list that I'd forgotten I'd hired someone specifically to handle wedding logistics. I found Valeria's number in my phone and called before I could talk myself out of it. She answered on the second ring and said my name like a question. I told her the wedding was canceled and I needed help dealing with the vendors. There was a pause, and then her voice came back softer. She said she'd heard what happened. One of the guests had called her yesterday to ask about getting their gift back. Valeria said she was so sorry and she wanted to help however she could. I felt my throat get tight, but I didn't cry. I told her about the list and asked if she could handle contacting everyone. She said most vendors had cancellation policies in their contracts. Some deposits would be lost, but she'd do her best to minimize the damage. She asked if I could write a brief statement she could share with the vendors so she didn't have to explain the details over and over. I said yes and thanked her. She told me to send the statement whenever I was ready, and that she'd start reaching out to vendors this week. We hung up, and I felt a tiny bit of the weight lift. At least I wouldn't have to call the florist and explain that my fiancé had a secret child and a side relationship. Valeria could just say the wedding was canceled due to personal circumstances and leave it at that. That evening, I was sitting on Claire's couch trying to write the statement for vendors when the intercom buzzed. Claire got up to answer it, and I heard Norman's voice through the speaker. He was asking to talk to me. Begging, really. His voice sounded desperate, and I felt nothing. Claire told him to leave. He kept talking, saying things had gotten out of hand and he just needed 5 minutes to explain. Claire said if he didn't leave, she was calling the police. I heard him say my name through the speaker, pleading. Claire pressed the button to end the call and came back to the couch. She asked if I was okay. I nodded. I pulled out my phone and looked at Norman's texts again. He'd sent 6 more since this morning. All of them were variations of the same thing. He was sorry. He loved me. He wanted to fix this. He never meant for things to go this far. I read them all and felt that same emptiness. No anger, no sadness, just nothing. I opened a new message and typed that we would communicate only through email about practical matters like the apartment and our shared belongings. I hit send and put my phone down. 30 seconds later, it rang. Norman's face filled the screen. He was calling instead of respecting the boundary I'd just set. I stared at his photo for 3 rings. Then I blocked his number. The phone stopped ringing. I felt a small surge of something that might have been power. It wasn't much, but it was the first time since yesterday that I'd made a choice that was entirely mine. The next morning, my phone rang while I was still in bed at Claire's place. The screen showed a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. A woman's voice introduced herself as the venue manager. She said Valeria had contacted her about the cancellation, but she wanted to reach out personally. I sat up and waited for whatever bad news was coming. She explained they couldn't refund the deposit because the contract was clear about cancellations within 2 weeks of the event. My stomach dropped. Then she said they were willing to apply the full amount to a future event if I wanted to reschedule within a year. I actually laughed out loud. The sound came out harsh and bitter. She went quiet on the other end. I told her I appreciated the offer, but I wouldn't be getting married there or anywhere else anytime soon. She said she understood and that she was sorry about what happened. I thanked her and hung up. The idea that I'd ever want to walk back into that venue made me feel sick. I spent the rest of the morning trying to figure out what I actually owed and what I could get back. Claire made coffee and sat with me while I went through every contract and receipt. The numbers kept getting bigger. I called my cousin Nadia around noon. She's a lawyer who specializes in contracts. She said she could meet me that afternoon. I got dressed in actual clothes for the first time in days and took the bus to her office downtown. Nadia's assistant showed me to a conference room with big windows overlooking the city. Nadia came in a few minutes later carrying a legal pad. She hugged me first and then sat down across from me. I handed her the folder with all my wedding contracts. She put on her reading glasses and started going through each document. I watched her face for any sign of good news. She took notes and made small sounds while she read. After 20 minutes, she looked up and said most of the vendors had solid cancellation clauses. I was probably out about $15,000 in deposits that were clearly marked as non-refundable. The number hit me like a punch. $15,000 gone because Norman couldn't tell the truth. I felt physically sick. Nadia reached across the table and squeezed my hand. She asked if I wanted to pursue any legal action against Norman. I could potentially sue for fraud or emotional distress. I thought about it for maybe 10 seconds. Then I told her I just wanted to be done with him. I didn't want months or years of court dates and lawyers and seeing his face. Nadia nodded like she expected that answer. She said she understood, but she'd put together some information for me anyway in case I changed my mind later. She pulled out a folder and explained what my options would be if I decided to go that route. I took the folder and thanked her. She didn't charge me for the consultation. She said family doesn't pay family. I left her office feeling both grateful and defeated. At least I knew where I stood financially now. 3 days after the wedding that didn't happen, I had to go back to work. I couldn't hide at Claire's apartment forever. I got up early and put on work clothes that felt strange after days in sweatpants. The bus ride felt too long. I kept thinking about what I'd say when people asked questions. My boss had texted saying to take all the time I needed, but I'd replied that I wanted to come back. Sitting around thinking about Norman was worse than being busy. I walked into the office and felt every eye turn toward me. People who normally said good morning looked away. My boss saw me and immediately came over. She pulled me into her office and closed the door. She said again that I could take more time. I told her I'd rather work than sit at home. She studied my face for a moment and then nodded. She said to let her know if I needed anything. I went to my desk and tried to focus on emails. My hands were shaking. Around 10, a coworker named Jessica stopped by my desk. She had this bright smile on her face. She said she saw the wedding was supposed to be last weekend and asked how married life was treating me. The words hung in the air between us. I felt my face get hot. I told her the wedding didn't happen. Her smile disappeared. She asked what I meant. I said it got canceled at the altar. Her expression went from confused to shocked to horrified in about 3 seconds. She started apologizing and backing away from my desk. I told her it was fine, but she kept saying sorry. Other people nearby had heard. I could feel them staring. I wanted to disappear into the floor. Jessica finally left, and I put my head down and pretended to work. The rest of the day crawled by with people either avoiding me completely or giving me sad looks. I'd never been so happy to leave work in my life. That evening, I was scrolling through social media when a message popped up from someone named Milo. The name seemed familiar. I clicked on his profile and recognized him from pictures with Norman in college. My first thought was that he was reaching out to defend Norman or make excuses. The message said he needed to talk to me about something important. He said it was about Norman and he knew I probably didn't want to hear from any of his friends right now. But he promised he wasn't reaching out to defend him. Something about the way he wrote it seemed genuine, not like he was making excuses. I stared at the message for a long time. Finally, I wrote back asking what he wanted to talk about. He replied almost immediately. He said it would be better to meet in person if I was willing. He suggested a coffee shop downtown. I told Claire about it and she said to meet him somewhere public and let her know where I was. I agreed to meet him the next day after work. The coffee shop was busy when I got there the next afternoon. Milo was already sitting at a corner table. He stood up when he saw me and shook my hand. He looked nervous. We both ordered coffee and sat down. He thanked me for meeting him. Then he said he'd been feeling guilty for months. I asked him why. He explained that Norman had told him about Vanessa and the kid last year. He said Norman mentioned it casually like it was something I already knew about. Milo had even asked Norman once how I felt about the whole situation with his son. Norman told him I was fine with it, and we were working on integrating his kid into our lives. Milo believed him. He said he only realized a few days ago that I'd had no idea. One of Norman's other friends had mentioned how shocked I must have been to find out at the altar. That's when Milo understood that Norman had been lying to everyone about what I knew. He looked miserable telling me this. Milo kept talking. He said Norman used to talk about me and Vanessa in this weird way. Like he was comparing us. He'd make comments about how different we were, how I was organized and driven and Vanessa was more spontaneous and emotional, how he got different things from each of us. At the time, Milo thought Norman was just talking about his past relationship versus his current one. But now looking back, it seemed like Norman was talking about two ongoing relationships. I felt cold listening to this. I asked Milo if he thought the hookup 3 months ago was really just once. Milo looked uncomfortable. He said he didn't know for sure, but Norman had mentioned seeing Vanessa multiple times in the past year. Always with some excuse about co-parenting or their son needing something. Milo had thought it was innocent at the time. Now he wasn't so sure. I sat back in my chair and felt the weight of it. The cheating probably wasn't one mistake. It was probably ongoing. I asked Milo why he was telling me all this now. He took a sip of his coffee and said Norman had called him yesterday. Norman spent 20 minutes painting himself as the victim, saying his private business got exposed unfairly, saying people were overreacting, saying I'd embarrassed him in front of everyone. Milo said Norman showed zero real remorse. He was just mad that he got caught. Milo told Norman he was wrong and Norman got defensive and hung up on him. That's when Milo decided he couldn't stay silent anymore. He said he felt like he'd been part of the lie by not questioning things sooner. I told him it wasn't his fault. Norman had lied to everyone. Milo still looked guilty, but he nodded. We finished our coffee and I thanked him for telling me the truth. He said if I ever needed anything or wanted to talk to reach out. I left the coffee shop feeling worse than when I'd arrived. Every new piece of information just showed me how blind I'd been. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay on Claire's couch staring at the ceiling. Finally, I grabbed my phone and started going through old photos. Pictures from the past 2 years with Norman. I looked at them differently now. In one photo from 6 months ago, Norman was checking his phone with this secretive expression. I'd thought nothing of it at the time. In another photo from a work trip he'd taken last spring, his smile looked forced. I remembered he'd been unreachable for hours that weekend. He'd blamed it on bad cell service. There were so many little things. Times he'd angled his phone away from me. Nights he'd come home later than expected with vague explanations about traffic or a work thing running long. Calls he'd taken in another room. I'd trusted him, so I'd never questioned any of it. Now every memory felt poisoned. I felt so stupid for missing all the signs. Claire heard me moving around and came out of her bedroom. She sat down next to me and asked what I was doing. I showed her the photos and told her about all the things I'd dismissed. She took my phone and set it down. She said I trusted him because that's what you're supposed to do in a relationship. She said his lying didn't mean I was stupid. It meant he was a liar. I wanted to believe her, but I still felt like I should have known something was wrong. We stayed up talking until almost 3 in the morning before I finally fell asleep. The apartment building looked the same as always, but walking up to it felt like approaching a crime scene. Claire parked her car and turned off the engine. She asked if I was ready, and I nodded even though I wasn't. We got out and headed toward the entrance. Norman was already waiting in the lobby. He stood up when he saw me and took a step forward with his arms slightly open. I stepped back before he could get close. His face did this hurt expression like I'd slapped him. Claire positioned herself between us and asked where we should start. Norman led us to the elevator without saying anything. The ride up to the 3rd floor felt endless. Nobody spoke. The doors opened and we walked down the familiar hallway to apartment 3B. Norman unlocked the door and I stepped inside a space that used to feel like home. Now it just felt like a place full of lies. I'd brought empty boxes and trash bags. Claire set them down by the door. Norman cleared his throat and started talking about how we should discuss things. I cut him off and pointed at the boxes. I told him we were here to divide belongings, not talk. He kept going anyway. He said he'd been scared to tell me about his son because he thought I'd leave. I stared at him. I told him I would have understood about a child from a previous relationship. Lots of people have kids from past relationships. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. But lying for 2 years was different. Cheating 3 months before our wedding was different. Norman actually tried to argue that the cheating just happened because Vanessa was emotional about co-parenting issues. Like that was supposed to make it better. Like being emotional was an excuse to sleep with your ex. Claire stepped forward and told Norman to stop making excuses. She said he needed to focus on dividing belongings, or she was calling my brothers to come handle it. Norman's face went pale at the mention of my brothers. He finally shut up. We spent the next 2 hours sorting through everything in complete silence. I moved through the apartment picking up items that were clearly mine. My books, my clothes, my grandmother's quilt. Norman kept trying to make eye contact, but I refused to look at him. Every item I touched reminded me of some moment in our relationship that turned out to be fake. The coffee mug I'd bought him for his birthday. The throw pillows we'd picked out together. The framed photo from a trip where he'd probably been texting Vanessa the whole time. I left everything we'd bought together. I didn't want any of it. Norman tried to insist I take the coffee maker we'd picked out on a vacation to the mountains. I snapped that I didn't want anything that would make me think of him every morning. He set it down and didn't argue. By the time we finished, I had 3 boxes of stuff. That's all I was taking from 2 years of living together. 3 boxes. Claire helped me carry them down to her car. Norman followed us and tried to say something as we loaded the trunk. I slammed it shut and got in the passenger seat without responding. Claire drove away, and I watched the building disappear in the side mirror. My mom called me that evening while I was unpacking at Claire's place. She sounded tired. She told me that Norman's mother had called her suggesting a meeting between our families to find a path forward. I almost laughed. My mom said she'd politely told Norman's mother that wouldn't be happening and asked her not to contact us again. The fact that his mom still thought there could be a path forward showed she understood nothing. There was no path. There was no forward. There was just a way. I thanked my mom and she asked how I was really doing. I told her I didn't know yet. She said that was okay and that she loved me. After we hung up, I sat on Claire's couch and realized I hadn't slept properly in days. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Norman at the altar. I saw his face when the phone rang. I saw his mother lying. I saw everything unraveling in front of 200 people. Claire suggested I talk to someone and gave me the number for Charlotte King, a therapist she'd heard good things about. I called the next morning and got an appointment for that afternoon. Charlotte's office was in a quiet building downtown. She was younger than I expected, maybe early 40s, with kind eyes and a direct way of speaking. She asked what brought me in, and I told her the whole story. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked what I needed to feel safe again. Not what happened or how I felt about it. What I needed to feel safe. The question caught me off guard. I admitted I was having trouble sleeping. She asked what was keeping me awake, and I said I kept replaying the moment at the altar over and over. She nodded and asked what I was looking for in those replays. I said I was trying to figure out how I missed everything. Charlotte leaned forward slightly and told me that wasn't the right question. The right question was why Norman chose to deceive me. She said I was angrier at myself than at him, and I needed to redirect that anger where it belonged. I felt tears starting and tried to stop them. Charlotte handed me tissues and said it was okay to be angry at myself, but I needed to understand that Norman deliberately deceived me. His deception said nothing about my intelligence or worth. It said everything about his character. We talked for the full hour, and I left feeling slightly less like I was drowning. The photographer emailed 2 days later. She said she still expected payment for the day, even though the wedding didn't happen. She'd shown up and taken pictures of the ceremony before it fell apart. Her invoice was attached. I stared at the number and felt sick. I forwarded the email to Valeria and asked if there was anything she could do. Valeria called me within an hour. She said she'd reached out to the photographer and negotiated a reduced rate. The photographer could still use the pre-ceremony photos for her portfolio, so she was willing to accept 60% of the original cost. It was better than nothing. I agreed and thanked Valeria for handling it. She said she was sorry about everything and hoped I was taking care of myself. I said I was trying. That night, I made the mistake of checking social media. Norman had posted a status about going through a difficult time and learning from mistakes. Several people who didn't know what happened had commented with support. Someone wrote that everyone makes mistakes, and growth is what matters. Another person said they were proud of him for being vulnerable. I stared at the screen, feeling my blood pressure rise. He was painting himself as someone going through a hard time, not someone who'd lied and cheated and destroyed someone else's life. I wanted to comment and tell everyone the truth. I wanted to share screenshots of our text exchanges. I wanted to expose every lie. But I closed the app instead. Claire was right when she said engaging with him would only make things worse. He wasn't worth my energy anymore. I closed the app and put my phone face down on Claire's coffee table. She looked up from her laptop where she'd been working on something and asked if I was okay. I told her I was done looking at his stuff, done caring what story he told himself to sleep at night. She nodded and said that was probably healthy. Then she suggested something that caught me off guard. She said I should write out everything I wanted to say to Norman but never send it, just to get all the feelings out of my head and onto paper. I stared at her for a second because it seemed too simple to actually help, but she insisted it worked for her after a bad breakup years ago. She grabbed a notebook from her desk drawer and handed it to me with a pen. I took it and sat cross-legged on the couch, staring at the blank page for a while before I started writing. Once I started, I couldn't stop. I filled 7 pages with anger and hurt and questions I'd never get answers to. I wrote about the moment at the altar when everything shattered. I wrote about feeling stupid for missing signs that seemed obvious now. I wrote about his mother's lies and his fake pregnancy excuse and how he tried to hug me at the apartment like nothing had happened. I wrote things I wished I'd said when he was making excuses, sharp words that felt good to put on paper even if he'd never hear them. When I finished, my hand was cramping and my eyes were burning, but I felt lighter somehow. Claire asked if I wanted to keep the pages or get rid of them, and I said I wanted them gone. She led me to her fireplace and handed me a lighter. I watched the pages curl and blacken in the flames, and it felt surprisingly good to see all those words turn to ash. My dad called the next morning and asked if I wanted to get lunch. I said yes because I knew he was trying to help, even though neither of us really knew what to say about everything. We met at a sandwich place near his office, and he looked tired when he sat down across from me. He started talking before I could even open my menu. He apologized for not seeing through Norman, said he seemed like such a good guy who treated me well. His voice cracked a little when he said he should have known something was wrong. I reached across the table and put my hand on his. I told him Norman fooled everyone, not just me. I said Norman was good at lying. That was the whole problem. My dad nodded, but I could tell he still felt bad about it. We talked about other things while we ate, normal stuff about work and my brothers and my mom's new garden project. It felt good to have a conversation that wasn't entirely about the disaster at the altar. When we finished eating, my dad paid the check and hugged me in the parking lot. He said he was proud of how I was handling everything, and that helped both of us feel less guilty about missing the signs. I ran into one of Norman's cousins at the grocery store 3 days later. I was reaching for cereal when I heard someone say my name. I turned and there she was, looking uncomfortable but walking toward me anyway. She said she'd been thinking about me and wanted to check how I was doing. I said I was fine and tried to move my cart past her, but she kept talking. She said Norman was really struggling with everything, like that was supposed to make me feel something other than angry. I stopped and looked at her directly. I told her he should be struggling since he created this entire mess by lying for 2 years and cheating 3 months before our wedding. Her face went red and she started to say something about how everyone makes mistakes. I didn't let her finish. I said mistakes are forgetting to call someone back or being late to dinner, not hiding a child and stalking an ex. Then I walked away before she could say anything else. My hands were shaking when I got to the checkout line, but I was glad I'd said it. Valeria called me that evening with final numbers on the wedding costs. I'd been avoiding thinking about the money part because I knew it would make me angry all over again. She went through each vendor and what they'd agreed to. The venue kept half the deposit. The caterer kept $1,000. The photographer took 60% like we'd negotiated. The florist kept everything because flowers had already been ordered. When she finished adding it up, she said I was losing about $12,000 total. It was less than I'd feared when I first started canceling things, but it was still a huge financial hit that made me want to scream. $12,000 gone because Norman couldn't tell the truth. Valeria said she was sorry and that she'd done everything she could to minimize the losses. I thanked her for all her help and hung up. Then I sat on Claire's couch and stared at the wall, doing math in my head about how long it would take me to recover from this. I decided to ask Norman to pay half of the lost deposits. It seemed fair since his lies caused the cancellation in the first place. I opened my laptop and started an email, keeping it formal and direct. I wrote out an itemized list of every lost deposit with the vendor name and amount. The total came to $12,347. I asked him to pay half, which was $6,173.50. I said it was only fair that he take some financial responsibility for the consequences of his actions. I read the email 3 times before sending it, making sure my tone stayed calm and factual. His response came back 2 hours later. It was long, way longer than it needed to be. He wrote about how he was already financially stressed from lawyer fees for the custody situation with Vanessa. He said he was barely making rent right now and couldn't afford to pay me anything. He went on about how he knew he'd messed up, but punishing him financially wouldn't help either of us move forward. The whole message made me want to scream. He was acting like paying for the damage he caused was some kind of unfair punishment instead of basic responsibility. I called Nadia and told her about Norman's response. She asked if I wanted her to send him a legal letter demanding repayment, and I said yes immediately. His refusal to take any financial responsibility was somehow more infuriating than the original betrayal. At least when he lied about his son and the affair, I could tell myself he was weak or scared or whatever excuse made sense. But refusing to pay for the mess he created was just selfish. Nadia said she'd draft something official and have it sent within a few days. The letter would request $6,000 within 30 days and outline potential legal action if he didn't comply. I knew he probably still wouldn't pay, but having it in writing from a lawyer felt important. It felt like I was doing something instead of just accepting that he could destroy my life and walk away without consequences. Norman's father called my dad a week after Nadia sent the letter. My dad called me right after and put me on speaker so I could hear what had happened. Norman's father had offered to pay $3,000 to help settle things and let everyone move forward. He said he knew his son had made terrible choices and he wanted to do something to make it right. My dad asked me what I wanted to do. I thought about it for a minute. $3,000 wasn't the full $6,000 I'd asked for, but it was better than nothing. I told my dad to accept it. I wanted this finished. I wanted to stop thinking about Norman and his family and the money I'd lost. My dad said he'd call back and arrange the payment. Norman's father sent a check 2 days later with a note saying he was sorry for everything. I deposited it without reading the note again. I started looking for a new apartment because staying with Claire indefinitely wasn't fair to her, even though she kept insisting she didn't mind. I spent hours scrolling through listings online, trying to find something I could afford that was available soon. Most places were either too expensive or too far from my job, or had terrible reviews about bugs or noise. I finally found a small one-bedroom in a building about 20 minutes from work. It was more expensive than I'd like, nearly $200 more per month than I'd been paying when I lived with Norman. But it was available immediately, and the building looked clean in the photos. I scheduled a viewing for the next day. The apartment was smaller than I'd hoped, with a tiny kitchen and bathroom that barely fit a shower, but it had good light and the bedroom was big enough for my bed and dresser. I put down a deposit before I could talk myself out of it. Moving into my own place 2 weeks later felt both scary and liberating. It was the first time I'd lived alone in 4 years. Norman and I had moved in together after dating for 6 months. Way too fast in hindsight. I'd gone from my parents' house to roommates in college to living with Norman, never really having space that was just mine. Claire and my brothers helped me move the furniture I'd taken from the old apartment. We painted the bedroom first, a deep blue-green color that Norman would have hated. He always said colored walls made rooms feel smaller and insisted everything stay white or beige. I bought 3 plants at the hardware store, the kind Norman said were too much work because they needed regular watering. I put them on the windowsill and felt like I was reclaiming small choices as my own. I had a session with Charlotte the day after I finished unpacking. She asked how I was feeling about the new apartment, and I told her it was strange but good. Then I admitted something I'd been thinking about a lot. I said I felt like I'd wasted 2 years of my life on someone who didn't deserve it. Charlotte leaned forward and asked why I thought it was wasted. I said because I could have been with someone honest, someone who actually wanted to build a real life with me. She nodded and then reframed it completely. She said those 2 years taught me what I actually need in a partner, what red flags to watch for, what boundaries matter. She said I learned I'm strong enough to walk away even when it's hard and public and embarrassing. I wasn't totally convinced yet, sitting there in her office trying to see 2 years of lies as some kind of learning experience. But I was starting to see that this experience taught me important things about boundaries and trust, things I probably couldn't have learned any other way. My brothers showed up the next Saturday morning with a truck and way too much energy for 8 a.m. They helped me carry boxes up 3 flights of stairs because the building didn't have an elevator. My oldest brother Joseph kept making jokes about how light everything was, saying I must have left Norman with all the heavy stuff. He wasn't wrong. I'd taken my clothes, my books, my laptop, and not much else. Everything we'd bought together stayed in that apartment because I didn't want reminders following me into this new space. We set up my bed first, then the dresser, then the small bookshelf I'd had since college. Joseph stood in the middle of my bedroom when we finished and looked around at the mostly empty space. He put his hand on my shoulder and told me he was proud of how I was handling everything. I felt my throat get tight because I hadn't been sure I was handling anything well at all. He said most people would still be falling apart, but I was already building something new. My other brothers nodded, and one of them said I was tougher than Norman ever deserved. Their support hit me harder than I expected because I'd felt so alone in this whole mess, even with Claire helping me. Having my brothers there, moving furniture and making stupid jokes and telling me they were proud, made me feel less like I was drowning. 3 weeks into living alone, I woke up one morning and realized I'd slept through the entire night without waking up anxious. It was the first time since the wedding that I hadn't jolted awake at 3 a.m., replaying the moment Norman's phone rang. I lay in bed staring at my ceiling and thought about my day yesterday. I'd gone to work, came home, made dinner, watched a show, went to bed. Not once had I thought about Norman. Not once had I checked his social media or wondered what he was doing or imagined what I'd say if I ran into him. A whole day had passed and he hadn't crossed my mind even one time. It felt like a small thing but also huge, like I was finally reclaiming space in my head that he'd been taking up for months. I got up and made coffee in my tiny kitchen, and even that felt different somehow. Lighter. Like the apartment wasn't just mine physically, but mine mentally too. A place where Norman didn't exist anymore. Vanessa sent me a message on social media a few days later asking if we could talk. I stared at the message for a long time trying to decide if I wanted to open that door. Part of me was curious about her side of everything, but another part just wanted to move on and forget the whole situation existed. I finally responded saying I'd meet her for coffee, mostly because I wanted to understand how Norman had managed to lie to both of us so completely. We met at a place near my new apartment on a Tuesday afternoon. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table looking nervous. She stood up when she saw me and immediately apologized, saying she had no idea Norman was engaged until she saw the wedding announcement online. She'd thought he was single and genuinely trying to be a better co-parent. I sat down across from her and ordered coffee, studying her face to see if she was lying. She looked tired and sad and honest. She explained that Norman had shown up at her apartment one day saying he wanted to be more involved in their son's life. He'd been absent for years, barely seeing the kid, and suddenly he was acting like father of the year. She'd been cautious but hopeful because their son deserved a dad who cared. Norman had told her he was single and focused on being a better person. He'd take their son to the park, help with bedtime, act like a real parent. Vanessa said she'd been shocked when he got angry about her calling me at the wedding, because that's when she realized he'd been lying about everything. She'd seen the announcement online 2 days before the ceremony, and tried to warn me, which is why she called. She said she felt terrible about the affair 3 months ago, but Norman had pursued her for weeks before she gave in. She'd been in a weak moment, missing the family they could have been and made a mistake. The morning after, she told him it couldn't happen again, and that he needed to stop coming around so much. That's when Norman started getting weird, showing up unannounced and talking about being a family. She'd threatened to call me if he didn't back off, which is why he panicked when her name showed up at the altar. I asked her directly about Norman's claim that their hookup just happened naturally, and she looked uncomfortable. She admitted he'd been pursuing her hard for weeks, bringing her coffee, offering to babysit more, saying things about how they belonged together. She'd resisted at first because she knew it was a bad idea, but one night when she was lonely and he was being sweet, she gave in. She regretted it immediately and told him they couldn't do it again. Norman had acted understanding, but then kept pushing, kept showing up, kept talking about second chances. That's when she realized he wasn't trying to be a good dad. He was using their son as an excuse to get back into her life. She told me she'd been relieved when I called her during the wedding because it forced everything into the open. She said Norman was now trying to get more custody of their son, probably to look responsible after everything that happened, but she was fighting it because his sudden interest in parenting was clearly fake. We ended up talking for 2 hours, way longer than I'd planned. By the end, I felt like we'd formed this weird alliance based on both being lied to by the same man. She gave me her number and said to call if I ever needed to talk to someone who understood what Norman was capable of. I thanked her and meant it. Walking back to my apartment, I felt strange but also validated. Hearing her side confirmed that everything Norman told me was a lie. He hadn't been a victim of circumstance or made one mistake. He'd been actively manipulating both of us for months, maybe years. That realization made me angry all over again, but it also made me grateful I'd found out before actually marrying him. Some friends invited me to dinner that weekend, people who'd been giving me space since the wedding disaster. I almost said no because I wasn't sure I wanted to talk about everything again, but Claire convinced me to go. We met at a restaurant downtown, and everyone was careful at first, talking about work and movies and anything except Norman. Finally, I brought him up myself, making a joke about how at least I'd gotten a good story out of the whole thing. Everyone relaxed after that, and we ended up laughing about some of the ridiculous parts. The phone ringing during the vows with that song. Norman's face when the phone flew into the fountain. His mother's terrible lie about the cousin. Being able to laugh about it felt like progress, like I was taking back the story instead of letting it control me. One friend mentioned she'd never fully trusted Norman because he was too smooth, always saying exactly the right thing. I stopped mid-bite and stared at her because she was absolutely right. Norman had always known what to say, how to make me feel special, when to compliment me or apologize or be romantic. At the time, it felt like he really understood me, but looking back, it seemed almost rehearsed, like he'd studied what women wanted to hear and perfected his delivery. I thought about all the times he'd said something that felt almost too perfect, too scripted. My friend said she'd mentioned it once to another mutual friend, and they'd agreed Norman seemed like he was performing sometimes rather than being genuine. I'd never noticed because I was too close to it, too in love to see the pattern. But now that she'd pointed it out, I couldn't unsee it. My boss called me into her office the following Monday, and I assumed something was wrong. Instead, she told me I was getting the promotion I'd applied for before the wedding chaos. I just stared at her because I'd completely forgotten about it with everything else happening. She said the decision was based on my performance over the past year, not sympathy about my situation. She wanted me to know I'd earned it through my work. Having something positive happen that had nothing to do with Norman felt incredible. It reminded me I was more than this failed relationship, more than the woman who got humiliated at the altar. I had a career I was good at, goals that mattered, a life that existed separate from all the drama. I thanked my boss and walked back to my desk feeling lighter than I had in weeks. That night, I checked my email and saw a message from Norman. The subject line said, "Can we talk?" I almost deleted it without reading, but curiosity got the better of me. He'd written several paragraphs about how he'd been doing a lot of thinking and growing. He said he understood why I was angry, but hoped we could meet to discuss everything like adults. He wanted a chance to explain himself properly and show me he'd changed. I read the whole thing twice, waiting to feel something. Anger, maybe, or sadness, or even temptation to hear him out. Instead, I felt nothing except tired annoyance that he still thought he deserved my time. I hit delete without responding because I had nothing left to say to him, and no interest in hearing whatever justifications he'd come up with. Norman was my past, and I was done letting him take up space in my present. Claire asked if I wanted to try meeting someone new, and I said maybe, not really believing it. She set me up with a friend of her boyfriend's anyway, someone named Daniel who worked in accounting. We met at a coffee shop on a Wednesday evening, and he showed up exactly on time wearing a button-down shirt that looked freshly ironed. He smiled when he saw me and pulled out my chair, which felt nice even though I kept waiting for some red flag to appear. We talked about work and hobbies, and he mentioned he'd just gotten out of a long relationship too. I appreciated that he was honest about looking for something casual, just wanting to get back out there without pressure. There wasn't any spark between us, no chemistry that made my stomach flip, but sitting across from him proving I could do this felt important. When we said goodbye, he hugged me and said he'd had a good time, and I believed him, even though we both knew we wouldn't see each other again. Walking back to my car, I felt lighter than I had in weeks because I'd put myself out there and survived it. Charlotte asked me what I wanted my life to look like going forward, and I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out. She waited while I sat there, realizing I had no idea what I actually wanted, because I'd been building everything around Norman's plans. He'd wanted to move to the suburbs eventually, so I'd started looking at houses outside the city. He'd said my job was fine but not ambitious enough, so I'd been considering a career change I didn't actually want. He'd dismissed my interest in taking art classes as impractical, so I'd stopped mentioning it. Charlotte handed me a notebook and told me to write down things I wanted to do that Norman had always shot down. I started with small things like trying new restaurants he'd called overpriced and wearing bright colors he'd said didn't suit me. Then I wrote bigger things like traveling alone and taking classes just for fun, and maybe getting a dog. Looking at the list, I felt angry at myself for letting him shape so many decisions without even noticing it was happening. Charlotte pointed out that recognizing the pattern was the first step toward changing it, and I wanted to believe her. I signed up for a pottery class at a community center near my apartment. Norman had made fun of the idea years ago when I'd mentioned wanting to try it, calling it a midlife crisis cliché for women who watch too many romantic movies. Now I sat at a pottery wheel with clay spinning under my hands and didn't care what he would have thought. The instructor showed us how to center the clay and apply pressure to shape it, and my first 3 attempts collapsed into lumpy messes. The woman next to me laughed at her own failed bowl, and I found myself laughing too, both of us covered in clay dust and completely focused on something that had nothing to do with our regular lives. Making things with my hands and watching them take shape helped quiet the thoughts that still popped up sometimes about what I could have done differently. By the end of class, I had a wobbly bowl that leaned slightly to one side, and I loved it because I'd made it myself without anyone telling me it was silly or impractical. My mom called to tell me that Norman's mother had reached out again through a mutual friend from church. She'd asked if there was any chance of reconciliation, suggesting we could all sit down and talk things through like adults. My mom had shut it down immediately, telling the friend that there was nothing to discuss and asking her not to pass along any more messages. Hearing my mom protect that boundary so I didn't have to made me want to cry with gratitude. She said Norman's mother seemed to think enough time had passed for everyone to move on, which showed how little she understood about what her son had done. I thanked my mom for handling it, and she said she'd handle it every single time if she needed to, because I deserved to heal without being bothered. I was at the gym on a Saturday morning when I noticed a couple in the park across the street setting up for wedding photos. The bride wore a flowing white dress and the groom kept making her laugh while the photographer adjusted lighting. 6 months ago, seeing that would have destroyed me, would have sent me home to cry about everything I'd lost. Instead, I felt relieved that I wasn't tied to someone who didn't respect me enough to be honest. The shift in my reaction caught me off guard because I hadn't noticed the healing happening gradually. I finished my workout and walked past the park on my way home, watching the couple pose under trees, and felt genuinely happy for them, instead of bitter about my own failed wedding. Milo texted asking how I was doing and mentioning he'd run into Norman at a mutual friend's birthday party. He said Norman had been telling people we broke up because we wanted different things out of life, which was technically true but deliberately misleading. I laughed at the audacity of Norman rewriting history to make himself look better, and told Milo I didn't care what story Norman told himself as long as he stayed away from me. Milo said Norman had looked uncomfortable when someone asked about me and changed the subject quickly. I appreciated Milo keeping me updated but told him he didn't need to report back anymore because Norman was my past, and I was done letting him take up space in my thoughts. I booked a solo weekend trip to a beach town I'd always wanted to visit. Norman had said it looked boring when I'd shown him pictures years ago, just a small coastal village without fancy resorts or nightlife. Now I drove there alone on a Friday afternoon and checked into a tiny bed and breakfast that overlooked the water. I spent Saturday on the beach with a book, letting the sun warm my face and the sound of waves drown out everything else. Nobody knew where I was, and I didn't have to check in with anyone or compromise on what I wanted to do. I ate dinner at a seafood restaurant by myself, and the waitress didn't look at me with pity, just brought me wine and asked if I wanted dessert. Sitting there watching the sunset over the ocean, I felt more peaceful than I had in months, maybe years. The trip reminded me that I could make myself happy without needing someone else to validate my choices. Charlotte pointed out during our session that I was smiling more lately, and the tension I'd carried in my shoulders for months had eased. I hadn't noticed the change happening, but she was right. I felt lighter without the weight of Norman's lies, and the constant low-level anxiety I didn't even know I'd been carrying throughout our relationship. She asked what had shifted, and I told her about the pottery class and the beach trip, and being able to see wedding photos without falling apart. Charlotte said those were all signs of genuine healing, not just time passing, but actual growth happening. I left her office feeling proud of myself for the first time in a long time, proud that I'd done the hard work of processing everything instead of just burying it. Vanessa texted asking if I wanted to meet for coffee again, and I said yes. We met at the same place as before, and she told me Norman's request for increased custody had been denied. The court found his motivations questionable since he'd suddenly become interested in more parenting time right after our wedding fell apart. Vanessa seemed relieved, and so was I, knowing his attempt to look responsible had backfired. She said he'd been angry about the decision, and tried to blame her for turning the court against him. I shook my head because of course he'd found a way to make himself the victim, instead of taking responsibility. Vanessa and I talked for over an hour about our separate experiences with Norman's manipulation, and it felt good to compare notes with someone who understood exactly what he was capable of. 6 months after the altar incident, I met Claire for dinner at our favorite restaurant. She reminded me how devastated I'd been that first night at the diner, still wearing my wedding dress and unable to stop crying. Looking at where I was now felt almost unreal. My own apartment that I'd decorated exactly how I wanted. A promotion at work that proved my worth had nothing to do with Norman. New hobbies that brought me genuine joy. Genuine peace that came from knowing I'd escaped something that would have made me miserable. Claire raised her glass and said she was proud of me for not just surviving but actually thriving. I clinked my glass against hers and meant it when I said I couldn't recognize that broken person I'd been 6 months ago, because I'd become someone stronger. I was pushing my cart down the paint aisle at the hardware store when I saw him. Norman's father stood near the brushes, holding a can of wood stain and looking like he wanted to disappear. Our eyes met, and he couldn't pretend he hadn't seen me. He set down the can and walked over, his shoulders tight. He said he was sorry for everything his son put me through. The words came out stiff, but they seemed real. I thanked him for the partial payment of the deposits and told him I was doing well, which surprised me because it was actually true. He nodded and looked relieved, like he'd been carrying that apology around for months. We stood there for another few seconds in awkward silence before he picked up his wood stain and headed toward the registers. I finished my shopping and drove home feeling lighter than I expected. My youngest brother called me on a Tuesday night and asked if we could meet for coffee. I knew something was up because he sounded nervous. We met at the cafe near my apartment, and he fidgeted with his cup for 5 minutes before finally telling me he got engaged. His girlfriend Hannah had said yes over the weekend, and they were already starting to plan. Then he asked if I'd be okay attending wedding planning events after what happened to me. I reached across the table and grabbed his hand. I told him I was genuinely happy for him and wouldn't let my experience cast any shadow on his celebration. He looked so relieved his eyes got watery. I meant every word because watching him glow when he talked about Hannah reminded me what real love actually looked like. We spent the rest of the evening looking at venue photos on his phone, and I felt nothing but joy for him. My boss asked me to find a photo from our company retreat 2 years ago for a presentation. I opened my laptop and started scrolling through old files. That's when I found them. Pictures from when Norman and I first started dating. There we were at that restaurant he took me to on our third date. Another one of us at the beach where he told me he was falling for me. I stared at the screen waiting for the pain to hit. Instead, I felt mostly nothing. Just a vague sense of looking at strangers. I mentioned it to Charlotte during our next session, and she said that was the truest sign of moving on. Not hate, just lack of emotional charge. She was right. Those photos could have been of anyone. Saturday morning, I sat in my favorite chair by the window, the one with the bright blue cushions that Norman said clashed with everything. I was drinking coffee and watching people walk their dogs in the park across the street. Sun came through the window and warmed my face. I had nowhere to be and nothing I had to do for anyone else. My apartment was decorated exactly how I wanted. My schedule was mine. My choices were mine. I realized I was genuinely happy with my life exactly as it was. The wedding that didn't happen turned out to be the best thing that could have happened, even if I couldn't see it at the time. It freed me to build a life that was completely mine. I took another sip of coffee and smiled at how far I'd come from that girl crying in a wedding dress at a diner. This version of me was so much stronger. Well, that wraps up whatever this was. If you stayed until the end, I assume curiosity got the best of you. Might as well come back next time and see if I top it.